So far, General Odierno, your number two, said this weekend that he believes that you have control over only 40% of Baghdad. Is that accurate? And how do you feel it's going in terms of clearing out and securing Baghdad and Anbar province?
Well, I think, Chris, as I mentioned to the press yesterday, we're ahead of where I thought we would be at this point in time. And then we are behind where we might have been in some other areas. Anbar province is an area that, as you'll recall, was assessed to be lost less than a year or so ago by the military intelligence folks that were in Anbar province. There's been a stunning reversal out there as tribes have said that whoever opposes al-Qaeda is with us. We want to fight al-Qaeda. Will you help us, coalition forces? And we have indeed done that. And then they have been tied into the ministries of Interior and Defense, so there's a linkage to the Iraqi government. In Baghdad, there are certainly some neighborhoods, as General Odierno said it yesterday, it's about 30% of the neighborhoods about which we have real concern. These are the areas of the fault lines between Sunni and Shia. We are focusing on them quite intently, and the additional forces will enable us to conduct additional operations in those areas. Outside of Baghdad, the Baghdad belts, as they're called, south and north of the city, are areas into which we are now going in much greater force. Again, areas in which al-Qaeda has had some sanctuary in the past. And then in Diyala province, an area to which some of the al-Qaeda fighters have moved as they have been pushed out of Anbar and out of some of the Baghdad neighborhoods, is an area that requires considerable additional attention over the coming weeks, and it will get that as well.
General, the Pentagon issued its quarterly report this week, and it indicated that there has been no measurable progress so far. Let's take a look. The Pentagon said the total number of weekly attacks on Iraqi civilians, Iraqi forces, and U.S. forces actually went up from the last month before the surge to the first 3 months of the surge. And the Pentagon report concluded the aggregate level of violence in Iraq remained relatively unchanged during this reporting period. General, why shouldn't we back home view that as disappointing?
Well, the aggregate level is about the same. We actually have borne the brunt of much more of that, as have Iraqi security forces, and civilians a good bit less. In fact, one of the metrics that we track, which is sectarian murders and executions in Baghdad, went down by months. It was down to about a third. By the end of April, it was down to about a third of where it was back in January. It did come back up, as we announced, in the month of May, a little less than half. That is trending back down again. The fact is that as we go on the offensive, the enemy is going to respond. That is what has happened. Car bombs have been coming steadily down. And as I mentioned, sectarian executions in Baghdad in particular have come down. So again, certainly it is a mix, and that is what I've tried to convey with my assessment, that we're ahead in some areas and we need to do some serious work in others.
Senate Majority Leader Reid this week questioned your credibility after you gave an interview in which you said you saw, quote, astonishing signs of normalcy in Baghdad, such as soccer games and open markets. And here's how Senator Reid responded. Take a look.
We're now back up to 1,000 attacks a day in Iraq. And for someone, whether it's General Petraeus or anyone else, to say things are great in Baghdad isn't in touch with what's going on in Baghdad, even though he's there and I'm not.
General, the argument seems to be that we're getting spin out of Baghdad and not the straight talk as to what the situation is there. Your response?
Chris, I've tried hard to be forthright all along in this endeavor. My testimony before the Senate in January, again in April, when I did a VTC in the middle of that as well, with every congressional delegation and with the press, I have tried not to pull punches. I base my assessments, what I offer, on personal observation, walking around Baghdad, driving around it, flying around it. The fact is that there are signs of normalcy throughout a good bit of Baghdad. There are tens of thousands of kids. They'll be out there tonight playing soccer. In fact, we flew around the city on the way over here today since they'd lifted the curfew just to see how things were going. There's traffic all over the streets. The markets are reopened and so forth. That is not to say, and in fact in that interview I followed and also warned, for example, that the mosque bombing could spark new violence. I have tried hard to present both the good and the bad, but I will not shrink from announcing that there is some good out there, if you will, that there is some normalcy, nor will I shrink from acknowledging that there is plenty of bad out there, as I did with the fact that we have to really focus on 30% of those Baghdad neighborhoods, and there's certainly not much normalcy in some of those neighborhoods which are under the threat of both al-Qaeda and then extremist militias.
So how do you feel when you hear a senator here in Washington say that you're out of touch with what's going on in Baghdad?
Chris, as I said, I am just going to present what I see. I am going to provide a forthright assessment. That's the same thing that we'll do in September. And frankly, we've got more than enough work out here to keep us occupied and to keep us focused and busy.
Let's talk about who's responsible for the situation in Iraq. In recent weeks, the president has been emphasizing the role of al-Qaeda. Let's watch.
The primary reason for the high level of violence is this. Al-Qaeda has ratcheted up its campaign of high-profile attacks.
But again, the Pentagon quarterly report tells a very different story, and let's put that up. It says much of the violence is attributable to sectarian friction, and as you pointed out, there was a substantial jump in sectarian violence in May. Isn't the Sunni-Shiite conflict much more responsible for the violence in Iraq these days than al-Qaeda, sir?
I'm not so sure about that, Chris. In fact, al-Qaeda is the Sunni violence. Al-Qaeda is the face of what is happening on the extremist Sunni side. They are carrying out the bulk of the sensational attacks, the suicide car bomb attacks, suicide vest attacks, and so forth. This is, I think, all of the individuals in the intelligence community, General McChrystal, the head of our Joint Special Operations Command, all of us feel that the central front of al-Qaeda's terror war is focused on Iraq. So I think it is appropriate to emphasize the role that al-Qaeda Iraq is playing and the role that they play in provoking and giving excuses to the extremist militias of the other side, of the Shia side, as a justification for what they are doing, ostensibly to protect the Shia people, but then in their own turn carrying out violence of their own. There is no question but that there is sectarian violence between, again, al-Qaeda, certainly between some other Sunni insurgent groups and these extremist militias. And that is, in fact, what we are trying to break the cycle of violence that can really damage a neighborhood, the cycle of violence that, in fact, tore the fabric of society in Iraq, and particularly in Baghdad, and especially in the mixed neighborhoods during the latter part of 2006 and into the early part of this year, with really enormous damage as a result.
General,